much. I'm really glad to be here. During the pandemic, I'm really glad to be anywhere, but I'm also really glad to be here because we had connection problems. But I'm beginning to think that this is the ritual beginning of every event at during the pandemic, is that there's some kind of Zoom problem and Grandpa's on mute and everything. So here we are, and there's not a better day to talk about stories and writing and connection than on this lovely snowy Saturday. I'm really happy to. I'm really so happy to talk to you. This is really great. Right now you're in a tiny little screen in my corner, but that's okay. Your words are big. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Gary. It's so lovely to be here, and I'm so pleased and excited to be talking about The Centaur's Wife with you, especially because you have been such a integral part of this book. So thank you for being here and for helping me welcome it to the world in this way.
No, thank you. It's been there's something really great about being a writer in Hamilton. There's a small community of writers, and we tend to know each other, and not like other cities where we know each other and we try and undercut each other, but we actually try and support each other. So it's really nice. I thought I should begin with a skill testing question because your book is about centaurs. So here is a picture. And you need to tell me, this is a famous picture. So here is a centaur, because a centaur is a creature that is a being that has the torso of a human and the body of a horse. So here's the question, which is, if a centaur was to wear jeans, which one do you think is the right way? You think there's a right one?
Well, I mean, maybe it's puritanical of me, but I feel like, we wear pants and lower body coverings to cover certain elements. So it would be, I think, option 2 for me is the one where the centaur's legs, like the front horse legs, are uncovered and the back horse legs are covered. I feel like those would be the ones, but I mean, who knows, right? Like, I'm not an expert on centaurs. I just wrote a book about them.
But one thing that actually, because it is when you're making a world and you can decide, okay, so there are centaurs, they're mythological, but you've invented a world for them and adapt the feelings for them. One thing I really loved was that you made them have 2 hearts.
Oh,
I mean, that's kind of like the gene question, except that it has like a deeper resonance, right? They have a human heart, and lower down they would have the horse heart, right?
Well, see, the interesting thing for me was in doing research for the book. I mean, I'm writing this book about centaurs, and I'm like, okay, I need to learn about centaurs, which is so ridiculous a thing to say, right? Because it's not like there are actual anatomy textbooks out there, real ones that,
right.
centaurs. But the internet being the wonderful thing that it is, if you go online and you Google centaur anatomy, people will give you gifts. There are drawings and imaginings of what centaur anatomy might look like. And so I looked at a few of them and just sort of got an idea. And one of the things that I found really interesting was that they posited that centaurs should probably have 2 hearts, because the amount of blood flow required to flow through both the human side of the body and the horse side of the body would require that much more effort. And I thought that was interesting. They don't have 2 hearts in my novel for that reason necessarily, but I just thought that, you pick up, and you would know this, Gary, you pick up so many interesting tidbits along the way when you're building a novel and building a new world, and some things make it into the novel and some things don't. This was one of those things that did make it in, maybe not quite in the way that I've initially envisioned it, but the way that it resonated throughout the book, especially with the centaurs in particular, because they're very much these mythological creatures that are sort of stuck between 2 worlds, and that sense of having a human heart and then also an animal heart in both physical and emotional terms was something that struck me pretty deeply in the course of writing the book. Yeah.
Oh, no, absolutely. And then the idea of the book is based around a deep connection between a centaur and a human, and in between centaurs in general. I mean, love and empathy is a central theme of the book. So the idea of having a large heart, or even two hearts, aside from being in two worlds. I mean, because you also, I think that's something that's interesting. You take a mythological figure and you think, how have we thought about that? How have these stories been told? And how am I going to bring some of that resonance into my world? But yet, what am I going to do with that? And I thought it was beautiful that you're exploring being in two worlds, being not only the human and the non-human, but just what it is to be, I guess, an other, to have difference, right, in the body and in being. So I mean, that maybe you could talk about that, actually, because there's an element also. The other one of the central characters, Heather, has a disability, and so I was going to read actually the blurb so we could sort of tell what the story is about, but. For this, well, we can just answer this question and then I'll read the blurb, which is a lovely blurb. Heather has a disability, and she connects to a centaur, and they're both somehow in one world and in another world, and they have a body difference. Mm-hmm. Can you speak about that? Because that's such a lovely part of the novel, and heartbreaking, both a double heartbreaking aspect of the novel.
Both the hearts, the human one and the animal one.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it was, and anyone who tries to write anything, I think will resonate with this, where, you have an idea for a story, and then by the time you're done, it sort of ends up being something, maybe what you were intending in the beginning, but then also something entirely different. And when I was writing this book and thinking about this book initially, sort of the ideas for it, I wanted to write about desire. I was thinking about what it means when you in particular, desire someone that you can't have, or for whatever reason you can't be together. And because my mind is strange and works the way that it does, I was like, well, obviously this happens in, if you fall in love with a centaur, you can't have them. That's just how it goes. So I was thinking about that initially, in that sense of like desiring a body that's forbidden, or desiring something that's taboo. And then as the story kind of progressed, in the sense of these centaurs, as I built their mythology, because they're not necessarily centaurs that have the kind of classical centaur beginning that we know of in Roman and Greek mythology. As I was building them, I was really sort of struck by their story and how they're sort of born of the love between a horse and a woman, but she doesn't necessarily know at the beginning that he's a horse, has kind of disguised himself as a man. And the children are born half human, half horse. And, they're completely shunned from society, and the father takes them away up to this mountain to kind of, protect them. And I was thinking about what it means when we exclude people who are other or different in some way. And as I was wrestling with this, as the novel was continuing to grow, because Heather didn't start out as a disabled character, and then maybe about a third of the way into writing the novel, I realized that, oh no, of course, actually she is, because even though she's not necessarily a centaur, she does exist in a body that moves differently from other bodies around her. And, what does that mean? We're all about telling stories about magic and difference and that sort of thing as a kind of fun intellectual exercise, emotional exercise. But what does it actually mean to have a body that's different in the world, right? And so in the novel, I really tried to look at that question of Heather, both existing with a body that's different. She walks differently. Walking is a little more difficult for her, but she still tries to do things like climb this mountain and go on these hikes and things like that. And then how does having a different body also play out for the centaurs, right? Both in terms of how they're shunned by society, and then also, the fun mechanics that you get to do as a writer, right? Like, what are the real world implications of being a centaur, right? How much do centaurs have to eat? How much energy do they have to expend over the course of the day? And how much do they have to imbibe in order to keep their energy levels up? Like, all of these kinds of questions were really, really fascinating. And it became, it's still very much, I think, a novel about desire, but it also became a novel about bodies and about grief, very much so. What happens when your world is kind of overturned and you're trying to make sense of a world that doesn't look the same anymore. So it all kind of, spilled out of that, the magic that happens, right? When you move from idea to what actually ends up on the page.
Yeah, I mean, it works. I think it works beautifully for that, about different bodies and disabled bodies. But of course, it also works everything as a metaphor for, I mean, everybody else is different than you, because they're not you. And so kind of bridging that gap of understanding and difference, and finding yourself in the world and reconciling your own physical presence in the world, I think. That's and in a changing world, because our world is changing. And I think maybe later we can talk about kind of climate change and some of the what happens to that world. Let me read the blurb. I like doing this. I've been listening to the podcast Backlisted. It's a British literary show. It's really great fun, and they always read the blurb, and it's kind of great just to hear what a blurb sounds like. But it's also a sneaky way of telling you what the book is about. So let me start with that, so that so people will have an idea of the context. Because this book, the official launch hasn't happened. So here in Hamilton, Ontario, people are getting the early. Right, so it's so exciting. So here's the blurb. Heather is sleeping peacefully after the birth of her twin daughters when the sound of the world ending jolts her awake. Stumbling outside with her babies and her new husband, Brendan, she finds that their city has been destroyed by falling meteors, and that her little family are among only a few who survived. But the mountain that looms over the city is still green. Somehow it has been spared the destruction that has brought humanity to the brink of extinction. Heather is one of the few who know the mountain, a place city dwellers have always been forbidden to go. Her dad took her up the mountain when she was a child on a misguided quest to heal her legs, damaged at birth. The tragedy that resulted has shaped her life, bringing her both great sorrow and an undying connection to the deep magic of the mountain, made real by the beings she and her dad encountered that day. Esteban, a centaur born of sorrow and of an ancient impossible love, and his two siblings, marooned between the magical and the human world. Even as those in the city around her, led by Tasha, a charismatic doctor who fled to the city from the coast with her wife, and other refugees, struggled to keep everyone alive, Heather constantly looks to the mountain, drawn by love, by fear, by the desire for rescue. She is torn in two by her awareness of what unleashed the meteor shower and what is coming for the few survivors, once the green and living earth makes a final reckoning of the usefulness of human life and finds it wanting. At times devastating, but ultimately redemptive, Amanda Leduc's fable for uncertain times reminds us that the most important things in life aren't things at all, but rather the people we want by our side at the end of the world. That's a great blurb.
It is a great blurb.
So lovely. And that's that thing about who do we want by our side at the end of the world, that of connection. So I think maybe one thing that we could talk about, it mentions fables, and there's a great line that recurs through the book, which is stories aren't always stories, or stories are always more than stories. Mm-hmm. Which is, yeah, and the character Heather tells stories to her children, and there's interleaved in the overall narrative, there are these other stories, and then things start to mix, and stories, the things you've heard as stories become part of the narrative, and the whole, so the centrality of story to help you imagine, to help you connect, to help you console, to help inspire you, to help frame the world. Can you maybe talk about stories, and even stories in general, and maybe folk or fables or fairy tales in specifically?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think folk and fairy tales specifically have always been stories that we tell to make sense of the world, right? Because they're stories that we tell. I mean, you know, in our culture now, we think about them primarily as stories that we tell young children, sort of as a way to instill morals in people and, you know, inspire them to go on the quest and, you know, achieve great things. But we also use fairy tales as cautionary tales, right? You think of something like Little Red Riding Hood, right? Which is, you know, be careful of strangers, don't go out into the woods alone, all those kinds of things. And these are messages that children learn when they're very young. But I think those messages that we learn as children get carried into the kinds of stories that we tell ourselves when we become adults. And I think, too, one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot, I mean, I wrote this book and finished it before the pandemic happened, before some own personal griefs that have happened in my life came to being. But one of the things that I was thinking about while I was writing and examining these stories is looking at, you know, what happens when when you're grieving or when you're upset, what are the things that you do to try and get yourself through, right? And one of the things that we do is we tell ourselves stories. You imagine, you have fantasies about dead loved ones coming back to life, or, speaking with them again. You imagine yourself in a better place, in a better set of circumstances. And with the novel, one of the things that I was doing for the character Heather in particular, who, has just given birth to twins. So she's exhausted and just kind of like bogged down by that. And then, a couple hours later, the world basically ends. And she's really having to struggle over the ensuing days and weeks and months with this reality, this new reality of being a mom, looking after these children, being worried about the fact that she's disabled, and sort of struggling with the sense of not being sure if she's strong enough for what her children need. And that's, something that's completely internal to her. It's definitely a narrative that she's telling herself in terms of, am I good enough? But she's also telling stories to herself to kind of make sense of this world and move through it. And another main character in the book, Tasha, who is a sort of, what's the word? Not colleague, but like contemporary of Heather. They end up in the same city space. She also is someone who stories have had a huge impact on her as well. She's a character who had night terrors when she was young, and her parents would tell her stories when she woke up in the middle of the night. They'd tell her stories to help her sort of, calm down and come back to life. And Tasha really clings to the story of their survival, right? Like, if we band together and we help one another, we will make it through. This is the story she keeps telling herself over and over throughout the book. And I was just really interested in the ways in which the stories that we tell really do have a huge impact on who we are and who we become, because they're not really only stories, you can choose. I think, especially as you're an adult, you can choose how much stock to put into a particular story, but they do still resonate. You do still carry them with you in some way. And I was just interested in exploring that in the context of, a world that's been completely destroyed by a meteor shower, as one does.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I was just about to write exactly the same book, and then I found that you'd written. So there, I had to throw out all my centers and meteor showers and crazy vines, and so
you have a great imagination. I'm sure that whatever else you come up with is going to be.
So far, I have a talking dog I'm working on. So I read a quote this morning from Bell Hooks. It was that the function of art is to do more than tell. The function of art is to do more than tell it like it is. It is to imagine what is possible. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's when we kind of reclaim stories and tell our own stories, as opposed to stories that we receive and we just take. Because I was thinking of that in relationship to your was it last year you published your book, Disfigured, your book about fairy tales and the disability narratives, and how they kind of close off possibility for people with disabilities. Mm-hmm. In the way that they represent the world and represent where someone's places the world. And I feel that this is also like that. The Centaurs are supposed to stay on the mountain because the world doesn't know what to do with them, is questioning them. Heather should change because she's disabled. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. It's, and it's that sense of the sort of the outright stories that we're told and that we tell ourselves, and then the implicit stories too, right? Mm-hmm. Heather, is a character much like myself. I also have cerebral palsy and walk differently. And, I have a limp much like Heather's that is more perceptible sometimes than others, and, fatigue that comes and goes and all these kinds of things. And I guess I was just interested with Heather in looking at the ways in which we internalize the stories that are all around us, right? Heather is someone who was made fun of when she was in school, and made fun of because of the way that she walked. There are also, like, her father dies on this mountain that looms over their city, and so she's sort of like made fun of but also shunned as a result of that. People don't quite know what to make of her. And those stories, right, the stories that other people tell about you, also have a huge impact on the person that you become and the way that you interact with the world. and they're the kinds of things that have layers, right? So as you grow older and sort of unpack the stories that you told yourself and that were told to you when you were young, they have resonating influences that just kind of keep going year upon year upon year.
Yeah, I was actually just thinking about that with your novel, that it functions like a fable or a folktale, but it's not a one-on-one correspondence. So there's all these things that we can talk about and point to. Depending on what's happening in one's own life or the world, it changes what it connects to. So yes, there's the end of the world, meteors come and upend everything. Well, we're in a pandemic. It's like all of a sudden, it's not the same thing as a climate catastrophe, but it's a different kind of catastrophe where we need to reconfigure our connections and figure out how to make it through. So it works. It has things to speak. It speaks to that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I feel like it is one of the, a story is, it has a closed meaning, it has an open meaning like that, so that it can then, like as you said, as you change, as you go through your life, but as life changes, then the story continues to apply. So it's not this is what this stands for. Yeah. But it just points out to the human experience in a number of interesting connecting ways, I think.
Yeah, I think what you say, Gary, about, that difference between the open and the close, right? Like that sort of, when I was writing the book, I was conscious of the fact that there were a lot of things, and it's always a struggle. Like, am I taking on too much? Is it all not going to work? Is it not going to fit? What's going to happen? That kind of conversation you have with yourself when you're lying awake at 3 a.m. in the morning thinking, is this ever going to get published? Is it ever going to find its way onto shelves? But I think one of the things that ended up being really powerful for me in the writing of it was making sure that things stayed open that way. Like, it's not necessarily a book that has answers for everything, but it faces questions. Like it looks at that question of stories and what stories do. Maybe doesn't have definitive answers for them, but kind of sits squarely in that space of, okay, we're just going to sort of sit in the middle of this mess, in the middle of this destruction, and let it hit you. And then you're right, it has ripples beyond sort of the immediacy of what's happening in the novel, because I think ultimately that's what we do as human beings, right? You sit outside in the world that you're in and kind of let the world hit you and see what resonates. And in this particular case, it happens to be a pandemic, which is very much a world-ending event in many ways, right? I mean, the world is definitely very different from the world that we knew a year ago, and has ended in some very particular ways. So I think the questions of grief and moving on and how you build anew from something that is gone are still very timely questions, even though that's not necessarily the exact same thing that's being explored in the book.
No, absolutely. I mean, and I think that, so even in terms of addressing a disability, while it does posit new stories for or inquiries into the disabled body, I think that also works for anybody of difference who sees himself. So it's just a place that it. Of course, that experience, those stories are just part of an expanded way of storytelling, but they still address all the things that literature always addresses. I think so. It's not about it's not a disability narrative. It is that also, but it's also about being in the world and finding your place and learning. Well, as I said, who do you want to be with at the end of the world is one thing. I think we need to talk about magic, and there's magic in this book. There's also the other thing which I think powers the book a lot and powers a lot of fairy stories is about transformation. I guess it powers a lot of narratives in general, right? People change. You start out one place and you transform in a number of different ways in your understanding and your place in the world. The world may change, but in this case, sometimes physically people transform, but the world transforms as well. So maybe you can. I mean, the world is completely different at the end of the book than it is at the beginning.
Yeah. And this maybe leads into sort of the environmental aspects of the book, which again is something, I didn't set out to write like a work of environmental or ecological fiction, but it did sort of just turn out that way. And I was talking to someone about it a couple of days ago, and they were like, "Oh, the world that you describe is really terrifying. Like, I've always thought that nature was, something lovely and benign, and it seems weird to encounter it in this terrifying way in the novel." For those who haven't read it, it obviously the book opens with, this meteor shower, and the world is basically destroyed, or civilization in many ways is destroyed, and there are only a handful of survivors. And then in the sort of coming weeks and months, while everybody's struggling to band together, the natural world just kind of runs amok. So you have these plants that are suddenly like growing, 10 times higher than they would, and all the sense of the sort of green and natural world kind of claiming and reclaiming, taking back what it used to be. And it was interesting to me to hear someone say, like, "Oh, I've never thought of nature as, terrifying. I've always sort of thought of it as beautiful and benign," because nature is terrifying. I think it's because we don't necessarily also think of it in terms of time, right? The reality of the matter is, if I was to encounter a plane crash in the Amazon or somewhere like that, I would probably be dead within 2 days if I was just abandoned in the jungle, right? Like, I wouldn't know what to do. And nature is not going to be safe and coddling to me. And I think the thing that happens in these environmental conversations that we're having now that I find really interesting is this renewed sense of, the world doesn't necessarily need us. Everybody talks about us as being caretakers of nature, and that's true. But I think the reality is, when we look at, impending environmental collapse, the ones who are going to feel that the most are us in many ways. I mean, obviously, yes, there are a lot of animal species that are being impacted, and that is something extremely important that we have to think about. But the world, in some way, shape, or form, is going to continue on without us, right? Like, you think about, again, abandoned theme parks or abandoned settlements and stuff in jungles and whatnot, and you see the green vegetation coming back and reclaiming, old rusted cars or whatever that have just been left abandoned in the wild. The world, has that, nature has that benefit of time. It can just sort of slowly, inexorably overcome us. And in the novel, this happens on a much more sped up time frame, which is why it's suddenly so terrifying, because you have people who are trying to survive and are suddenly, faced with nature, which is in many ways being very sort of actively hostile, where people are trying to grow gardens and the gardens aren't producing food, and there's all these sort of poisonous plants popping up everywhere, and that kind of question of the world taking itself back was something that really interested me in the course of writing it.
And then part of it is, for the characters, like now, figuring out, well, first of all, what is happening, and is this thing that is happening, is it really happening, and trying to understand that. What do we do about it, and how do we band together, or how do we find meaning in a confusing world, which I think is sort of broad and a very changing world, I guess.
Yeah, because it is that sense of transformation, right? That what happens, because the world is always changing around us. It's just changing at a slower scale, right? And what happens when it changes in an instant like that? How do you adapt? What are your coping strategies? What are the stories that you tell yourself in order to make it through?
And there are this group of centaurs who I'm trying to say all this coded so I don't give away all the story, right? Like that amazing scene in McDonald's where they all are, they do the drive-through in the Porsche dressed in clown suits. It's amazing, So there are these centaurs, and who basically say, well, humans, you just mess things up. The world doesn't want you, like, too bad. And then there's the humans, of course, who want to survive. And then there's like Esteban, and who is caught in between, and who want to help the humans and understand that it's this balance between these different forces, right? So it does examine what it means to what is our role in the world. Like, when we're not dominating the world, we have to then work with the world and listen to what the world is telling us, which is what we're learning in sort of these modern in the Anthropocene in the climate change times. Yeah. Maybe we should talk about, because this sounds quite dire so far, what we've talked about in many ways. But there are these very difficult things. There's a lot of loss, a lot of grief, a lot of death and heartbreak. But there's always it feels like there's constant searching for connection and for love within the context of loss, I think. And that to me is something. The blurb says something about ultimately redemptive.
Yes, so, at times devastating, but ultimately redemptive. There we go.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's true. That we're in the middle of a pandemic. We're in the middle of an earthquake. But somehow we simple humans, or humans and our Centaur people whom we love, somehow that real connection and care for each other and want to being with each other and kind of belief in life fundamentally through grief, through devastation, is something that is hopeful and that keeps us going, I guess.
Mm-hmm. I think, I know I certainly have been guilty of this in the past. I think there's been a real Hollywoodization of narrative and personal narrative, in this kind of sense that, things always have to be happening in fireworks, and there always have to be these big things going on. And if you're going to tell a story, not that you necessarily always have to have a happy ending to it, but, there has to be a very clearly defined arc where someone it's the fairy tale influence, right? Where someone undergoes a quest, encounters difficulty, but then also, triumphs in some way, some real tangible way at the end. And I guess I was interested in writing the novel in looking at that question of what happens when, the triumphs that you encounter maybe aren't tangible as such, or aren't as sort of easily recognizable as those things. In the sort of landscape of grief that these characters are moving through, and the kind of, the small victories, sometimes they're like so tiny as to be almost unnoticeable, the victories that they encounter and the sort of things that they do. And that question of survival, right? Sometimes survival is just like getting up and moving through the day, one slow step at a time, and then going back to bed. Like that is a triumph, but it's not a sexy one. Those aren't the kinds of triumphs that we necessarily see all the time, I think, in mainstream culture. Certainly in the Western world, I think, and it's been interesting to watch the pandemic kind of lay that open, this new sort of reckoning of grief and anxiety and stress in the context of the pandemic, and this question of, what happens when, again, the world changes and it becomes something that you don't understand, and you sort of, your work of understanding it happens on that slow time scale where things are always sort of much smaller, much harder to discern. How do you operate in a world like that? These are questions that the characters in the novel are really trying to understand. And it wasn't something, that I finished this at the end of 2019, so I wasn't thinking about the pandemic when I was writing it. But still, as you said earlier, right, thinking about those kinds of issues, which are universal and are always things that we're grappling with. And I just so happen to sort of feel very prescient right now, given the context in which we currently find ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also that, you say you get up, you manage to make it through the day, and then you go to sleep. However, I think part of that is you're able to feel love for people, you're able to remember people, you're able to feel grief, and your characters do that. They have, even if it's a pandemic, you're in your sweats, you do little else but watch Netflix, and then you go back to bed, you still are feeling like I guess what I find that is deeply hopeful about this book, and it is that it honors those feelings, that the people feel the full range of what it is to be human, and some characters who are kind of awful end up coming to kind of compassion and empathy, and there's sort of abiding love between characters, and that, even if you're in sweats watching Netflix, is a triumph, and is a kind of large theme, like sexy large theme, that writing can do. There's a really beautiful, you have a beautiful epigraph from D.A. Powell. To survive is an astonishing gift. The price of that gift is memory. So that they survive, and it's a gift to survive. But the memory means that they also they live with grief, they live with loss. But that's a gift too, right? That's part of that. The astonishing gift is to survive, but also to survive with that. It's built into, it's hardwired into surviving is things changing and loss, I think.
Because I think too, when you feel loss that acutely, when it hurts you that much, I mean, grief for lost loved ones in particular, I think hits so hard because you understand that you had something really special and extraordinary, and it's now gone. And there is, again, that word, I feel like I keep repeating myself, but there's a reckoning that comes with that, right? And I see this now with a lot of newspaper articles and conversations that are happening about grief in the pandemic. And there was one in, I think it was the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, by the man, and I forget his name, but he co-wrote one of the books with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross about grief, and he continued writing about them after she had passed away. And he was talking about how one of the things that he's saying with a lot of people now who are talking about grief and thinking about it in the context of their own lives is, people are recognizing how grief has changed them and how this kind of trial and these sort of terrible things that nobody would choose to go through really do change you fundamentally on a molecular level in many ways. Yeah. And it does it through that work of, the astonishing gift of survival is also a really complicated gift of survival, right? Because you become a different person. You become someone who's sort of always carrying these hurts and these experiences on some level. But I think one of the things that was hopeful for me in my own grief journey, but then also in the course of writing the book too, was just recognizing that actually who you are as a human being can actually expand to encompass all of these things, and that you become more in the course of experiencing these things. No one would actively choose to go through them. And, I think we would, all of us, 201, absolutely give everything that we've, become in terms of being different people through grief. You'd give it all back in an instant, absolutely. But I think that the point is that you can't, right? That isn't a choice that we get as human beings. So you just have to continue forward and sort of make your path the best way that you can. And that sometimes that path is like, waking up and watching Netflix and then going back to bed and just being like, that was my day. This was what survival looked like today. And in other ways, survival is much harder, as we know, right? It looks different for everybody.
There's a lovely quote I put it in my novel that I thought a lot about. It's by the poet Marvin Bell, and he says, "It seems to me the heart must expand to meet the losses we have ahead of us." So, which I think is really beautiful, but it also means that the heart does expect, like, if you're going to be able to manage it, like somehow we stumble through, and our heart does expand, which means, as you said, you change, you kind of encompass this. And I guess I would also tie this back, I guess, to where we started with, to about stories, right? One of the things that you do with grief is you tell stories about that grief and about the experience, but also those people whom you've lost, right? And those experiences that you've been through, somehow you've lived to tell the tale of maybe of meteors destroying a world, of people dying, of losing children, of parents, of lovers, of, everything, right? And that's, you come away with hopefully with an expanded heart, or at least and maybe a story, I think. This is what I think this novel is about, amongst other things. Yes or no? What do you think? Am I right?
Away with the second heart. This is what they don't tell you in the blurb is that you actually will grow a second heart in the course of reading this novel and come away with two of them, which will hopefully, stand you in good stead for the months ahead.
My second heart's going to have high cholesterol too, and it just means I have to doubly avoid French fries.
Yeah.
Is that what you
it does.
We have a question from the Ashley asked about if this is a story about hope, which I think we talked about, because I was saying yes, it was, and I think you were agreeing that that's hardwired in there. Annie asked a question about the power of stories. Is there so we talked about the power of stories, and is there a story that's influenced you particularly that you'd like to speak about?
I don't know if I could pick one story in particular. I mean, there are certain writers, obviously, that I've been really drawn to. Cheryl Strayed is an American writer who writes a lot about grief and you know, the messy business of living. I really enjoy her work. The surrealist writer Leonora Carrington, the writer in the early 20th century, is really, really I think she's gaining more of a following now, and I'm really pleased to see that. She writes some really wonderful, weird, beautiful things. I think, you know, the sort of wider story, I guess, that I've been drawn to is that redemption narrative, right? The story of triumph on some level, but also recognizing, as we've talked about here, that the triumph doesn't always mean, you know, happily ever after, riding off into the sunset, marrying the prince or the princess kind of deal, right? Like sometimes it's a much smaller, quieter happiness, but still very much deserved. And even happiness itself can be quite complicated, right? And is not as simple a thing as we make it out to be. So I think that is the story that has influenced me the most, you know, that question of what do we do to get happiness? And then when you get there and you realize that happiness isn't necessarily the thing that you imagined, what happens after that?
Whenever I think about those stories about the princess marrying the prince or whatever, I always think when I got married a long time ago, I married my wife, who was a lawyer, and my mom sent me a funny card that said, "Congratulations on marrying the person we always hoped you'd become." Which I think it's hilarious, but it's exactly like, no. You don't have to marry the prince and become like the little wifey. You become like the prince. You become the person. You know, the princess is the person, right? Who is everything already, right? So I love that. Maybe we should talk a bit about. There's a question about advice for someone starting out as a writer, but I want to ask before that, just talk a little bit about all of the stories that you mentioned, or many of the things, were incorporate magic realism, like sort of the magic, the fabulous, the not strictly realistic. Maybe can you talk about that? I mean, is that transformation? Is that about possibility? What is that?
So I have always been a big fantasy reader. Obviously read all the classics, Tolkien and Narnia and all those kinds of things, science fiction as well. But I always sort of, you know, when I was growing up and thinking, I went to the University of Victoria to do my undergraduate degree in writing, and then I did a master's degree in writing as well. And for a long time, I really felt like you needed to write a very sort of realistic kind of story, the sort of Alice Munro story, who I love. In order to be taken seriously as a writer in Canada, especially. But I was always drawn to these narratives where strange things happened, and, you know, found myself sort of almost, you know, unwillingly writing weird stories about, you know, my first novel was about a man who wakes up one day with wings, and that actually came out of a story that I wrote in workshop when I was in university. And it really resonated quite well with people. And I think one of the things that I've realized over the last sort of decade and a half was how much that sort of fabulous kind of, you know, genre or lens, where, you know, characters live in a world that ostensibly looks like our world and sort of follows the rules of our world, but also, you know, weird things happen in it at the same time, has actually been a really freeing thing to understand, and that you know, I really like. I really like this kind of canvas in which to operate as a writer. I feel like there are no rules for me aside from what I would like to have to do. And I think it's probably something that I will stay squarely within the realm of that, you know, for at least the next couple of books. And then maybe after that, I'll try to be really experimental, and I'll write like a suburban novel about a woman who works at a library, for example.
Yeah. there could be nothing more magic and fabulous than that. Come on, how could that be? But I think about, I heard Wabgashig Rice talking about, he's got his Moon Over the Crusted Snow, and which is the novel that happened is a dystopia. The world has ended, right? And he said, well, as an Indigenous person, well, the world has already ended. So this is a kind of realism, and I think that also so many of these things that are written about. They are really representing the experience of being in the world, right? Even if maybe they're, to make you notice, you have to kind of change it into something more fabulous, or like so fabulous, something more magic, so that you notice what it is to be like, to be different, to wonder where home is. Well, then maybe write about a centaur, for example.
Yeah, exactly, right. To make sense of the body that you have in the world that doesn't believe in your body, for example, right? Write about a creature that isn't believable. Mm-hmm.
And we, of course, realistically feel the feelings that these characters feel, and understand these worlds that they live in.
I think there's also something that happens with magic realism and fabulism as a genre, where people, when they read, they understand that there's a certain suspension of disbelief, and they just kind of go with it. Whereas, I found, paradoxically, world building in realism, in the stories that I write that are real or realist, has actually been more difficult in some ways, because there isn't that suspension of disbelief, right? People won't just allow anything to happen. So I feel like you're working, for me anyway, I feel like I'm working with more constraints. So it's a form that I really enjoy. And I feel like it's also, for a reader, a form that allows people to connect with deeper, darker issues sometimes. There's a kind of magic that happens when you're reading as a reader, and just sort of letting everything happen, letting everything that's difficult and complicated about the world of the book, but then also difficult and complicated and strange about the world in which you live, because the world is strange. It's a very weird place.
And there's that marvelous thing that happens when you essentially say, like, once upon a time.
Yes. Yes.
You're right in there, right? You're there. It's just it's begun already.
Yeah, exactly.
But as you said, it profoundly connects you to what it is to be you, to have a life through this like remarkable ability of story. We are almost out of time, so I do want to ask you Pat's question about advice for someone who's starting out as a writer. Mm-hmm. What would you say about that?
So I think one of the most important things you can do when you're starting out as a writer is to read, obviously. Read everything you can get your hands on. Read things that you love, first and foremost. And then also, dabble in things that you're maybe not sure about, and see what you like about those things, if you can find them. But also, surround yourself with community. Seek out writers groups, seek out reading groups or book clubs. Try and find like-minded people who are maybe writing some things that are similar to you, or writing in the ways that you would like, because the community is really what will get you through. I mean, Gary, you know this, right? You're such a good pillar of the Hamilton writing community, and then the writing community at large. I think is part of the magic of being a writer, is being able to connect with other people who do this weird, most solid thing that you do alone in your house in front of your computer. And then you have those moments of being able to connect with other people who are like, oh yes, I also am weird and stay alone in front of my computer writing things that come out of my head. And there's a real camaraderie and sense of connection there that it's been so invaluable for me as a writer. And then the craft side of things, comes out of that, comes out of the reading, comes out of being exposed to other writers and sort of things that they do. It all kind of flows from there.
It makes me think, I was once in a coffee shop and I was working on a novel, and I was playing a scene and I was talking and I was moving my hands around, and then I realized I was in a coffee shop, and I looked around and was like, oh my God. But right beside me was Miranda Hill, the writer, and she's like, "Yeah, I understand what's going on. Yeah, this is what you do." So it's good.
What Gary needs to do.
It's good, yeah. So no, that's lovely. And there are lots of events through the library and through reading series in Hamilton too that are available, and so you get to actually talk and meet other writers. So it is a really, I think it is a really lovely community to be part of in Hamilton. So my final question, because I saw you started posting on Twitter. You use Twitter a lot for advocacy, for speculation about junk food, dogs, but also you've been posting little bits of you're writing some new work about like there are fairy tales, folk tales you're writing. Can you maybe speak about that just to end? So what's coming up next for you?
So every Friday, I post a snippet of a little fairy tale on Twitter using the hashtag Fairy Tale Friday, and then what I have been doing is posting the full expanded version of the tale on YouTube. So I read the story and then post it. I'm a little bit behind in posting to YouTube. I've been just a little bit busy in the last couple of weeks, but my hope is that I'll be able to continue it throughout the year and write just these tiny little fables, 500,000 words for each, so that I'll have, a series of fables over the course of the year that I get to share and inhabit. So I'm working on that as a story collection. And I'm also working on another weird novel now, which, has sort of been percolating in my head for a while and is finally starting to make its way to the page. So I'm interested to see what will come of that.
And so at the beginning of a novel, it's just you have some ideas and you just jump into it like into a swimming pool and see what happens, or sorry, into a deep ocean filled with tentacular creatures that may or may not be friendly.
Octopi, yes. It depends, actually. It depends on the project. Usually in the past, I have sort of, jumped in and just started writing and being like, I don't know where this is going or what's happening. With The Centaur's Wife, it started from a short story that was about 2,500 words. And then it just kind of kept growing and growing beyond that. I didn't really know what was happening in the plot. It took a long time to figure that out. This new project that I've been thinking about it for most of the last year, and I haven't actually done almost any writing in the pandemic, just because, pandemic and then also grief and all of those other wonderful things. But I'm at the point now where I sort of have a structure in place and I know how it's going to begin and end and kind of the arc that it's going to take to get there. So, which is interesting. I don't usually write that way. So We'll see. We'll see if it turns out or if it's in fact terrible, which, it could go either way at this point.
The nice thing about writing is that if it is terrible, it's not like you get to keep working on it until it's not terrible, until it's great. Like that's unlike, say, if you've cut something out of marble, it's sort of too late to put those pieces back, but you can do that with writing, which is sort of an amazing thing about writing. Just unless there's any other questions from the audience, I think that we maybe it might be time to wrap up. Can you show your book? I don't have a copy of your book. I just read it off the PDF. So because it's a beautiful cover, and it's available. Is it available now, or it will be?
It's officially available on February 16th, so this coming Tuesday. It is available now. I think bookstores have been given the okay to sort of let it out into the world. And in case anyone is interested, it's available in print, in audio, in ebook, and then it's also available in a variety of accessible formats. So if you follow the Canadian Centre for Equitable Library Access, celalibrary.org, or the National Network of Equitable Library Services, NELS.ca. They have a variety of accessible versions of the book that can be accessed for those who have print disabilities. So it's been published in Braille, which is really awesome and really cool. It's also been published in accessible digital ebooks. So yeah, so it's great. So it is available. If you're watching from Hamilton, please feel free to order through Epic Books, our wonderful independent bookstore on Lock Street. Also J.H. Gordon Books on King Street carries it, as well as King West Books on the other side of King Street. They all do, and I'm always happy to sign copies too. So if anybody orders through there, you can just send them a message and I will come and sign or personalize your copy.
It's that connection with the author and, having interacted with the book is lovely. And this is the first fully accessible book that Random House has published, right, in Canada? So that's a tremendous first step. Let's hope that. Yeah,
and I'm hoping Random House, they do have a couple other books coming up that will be published this same way, and they just a couple of weeks ago signed a partnership with CELA, where they're going to let their backlist, a bunch of titles on their backlist will be made accessible through the CELA archives as well. So it's really exciting to see these kinds of differences start happening, because it means that now everybody can access a book at the same time, whereas in previous years, a book would come out in maybe one or two formats initially, and then people who maybe couldn't access those formats for a variety of different disabilities wouldn't be able to read the book until, months or even a year later. And I'm really excited that, this one gets to go into the hands of whoever wants to read it whenever they would like to.
Yeah, and not only bookstores, but then libraries can have access to it, and those books can stay, which is also a good source too. This is so great to talk. I've read this book twice now. I read it before because I got to blurb it, which was really lovely. And then I just read it in advance of this. And so it continues to surprise and delight and move and inspire. So thank you very much. It's been really, really lovely to talk to you. And I'm really glad we solved our technical problems so I could do this, and so that everybody could join us and share our conversation. So thank you very much, Amanda.
Thank you so much, Gary. It's always so lovely to talk to you, and I'm so glad that I could share my first official Centaur's Wife event with you. It's been such a pleasure.